Welcome, builders of the internet. My name is Jessa, and today I'm going to talk about the effects of changing pandemic restrictions in the UK, particularly for England. I'll briefly cover the timeline of the UK government's restrictions during the coronavirus pandemic, then I'll talk through the data that I've collected based on a survey that's been sent out to people. As always, you can find my sources in the description.
My mind.
What's the situation in the UK? After the first COVID-19 death on January 30th, 2020, the government eventually brought in social distancing measures on the 16th of March, before introducing the stricter lockdown procedures on the 23rd. People could only leave the house to shop for necessities, exercise once a day, commute to or from necessary work, or a select few other reasons. Many shops were forced to shut, and large public gatherings were no longer allowed. Over 2 months later, on the 1st of June, lockdown restrictions were eased for many, with the clinically vulnerable being allowed to spend time outside, and people also being allowed to meet up with up to 5 other households. It was at this point that schools also reopened for reception, Year 1 and Year 6. Then, a week later, new measures to the UK borders were introduced. So this meant that apart from a short list of exemptions, anyone entering the UK had to self-isolate for 2 weeks. On the 13th of June, support bubbles were brought in, so adults living alone could join with one other household. 2 days later, on the 15th, shops selling non-essential goods reopened, and face masks were deemed mandatory on public transport. Apart from Leicester being the first place in the country to enter back into a local lockdown at the end of June, due to the surge in cases, restrictions were generally easing and things were creeping back into normality. In fact, throughout the entirety of August, there was an Eat Out to Help Out scheme, with 50% off food in restaurants to encourage people back into local businesses. And some places even continued on with these deals throughout September too. In September, all students went back to school. Then on the 14th, the rule of 6 was introduced, where people could no longer meet indoors or outdoors in groups of more than 6 people. 10 days later, on the 24th of September, pubs, restaurants and other businesses had to close at 10 p.m. On October the 14th, this was when the infamous tier system was introduced. At this point, there were only 3 tiers. The first was medium alert, with the most freedom. Tier 2, high alert, had an increasing amount of restrictions, and Tier 3, very high alert, was the most limited, where you could only meet up with groups of up to 6 people outdoors. Shops and gyms were still open for everybody at this point, but at Tier 3, restaurants and hospitality venues had to close. The second national lockdown was between the 5th of November and the 2nd of December, returning back to the tiered system after this, but this time, on the 20th of December, Tier 4 was introduced, which essentially meant that people in these areas had to stay at home, which was a real shame for many over the Christmas period. At the beginning of January, pretty much a day after schools had returned, Lockdown the 3rd started, which brings me to the day I'm currently filming this, where we're still in lockdown and there's no clear date yet on when this lockdown restriction will end. Survey creation. In order to help keep myself busy and help put perspective on things, I decided to create a survey online towards the beginning of January and managed to get around 150 responses by the middle of February. The survey had 10 questions, so I guess I'll just talk through some of these questions and responses. Response. So the first few questions were to get a general gist of the people that were responding to my survey. As you can see from this chart, over half the people were in the 18 to 24 age category. About 30% were between 25 and 34, and the remaining 16% or so were over the age of 35. In terms of employment status, most were employed and working full-time, then the second largest category was full-time students. This question was definitely an area of the survey that I could improve on if I were to do something like this again, because it didn't really encompass all the possible options, such as full-time student and working, self-employed, and other options that people gave in the other category. When it comes to the respondents' locations, you can see from this map that I have managed to get responses from different parts of the world, which I thought was pretty cool, but I probably should have specified when I was sending this out to people that I meant it was for people in the UK, which I now know better for next time. So if we zoom into the UK, you can see over here that we have a couple of responses in Scotland, but the vast majority of respondents were based in England, particularly in the east and southeast regions, with 35 people based around London, 32 in Cambridge, and over 30 in Essex too. The first question I asked about the pandemic restrictions was, what did people think about the frequency of the changing regulations? Of which over half the respondents said that they thought it was changing too much. 33% thought that they're changing about the right amount, which I interpret to mean that yes, they are fine with how often the situations are changing, and then the last 17% said that they're not changing enough. I had 12 worded responses in conjunction with this, where some people expressed that they didn't really pay attention or weren't particularly bothered, and I also thought that some people made some additional points that were quite good in saying that they thought the government seems to be updating the regulations a bit too late in order to maximise the positive short-term results. For example, the government only enforced travel restrictions to and from different countries months after the first lockdown, when many people see the UK as having a major advantage of being an island, where this can limit the number of people that are potentially bringing in the virus. I think it's really worth noting what another comment has addressed. These answers would probably change depending on which stage of the lockdown that they were answering. Say for example, at the beginning of January, which is when I first sent out the survey, the tier restrictions were all in recent history, and it seemed like too many changes for some people. But now approaching the end of February, being in lockdown for nearly 2 months has enabled the situation to be clearer, which I definitely see where they're coming from when they pointed this out. My next question came back with varied answers, but the most popular response, with about 31%, thought that when new rules are introduced, it is somewhat clear what is allowed and what isn't. I gave 8 options for this answer, splitting it by degree of clarity. So for example, extremely clear was at one end of the spectrum, neither clear nor unclear was in the middle, and not at all clear was on the opposite end. 41% overall thought that regulations are on the unclear side, and 44% said that it was clear. I think this mix is really interesting and makes me quite glad that I sent out this survey, because I know that amongst the circles of people that I talk to, there is a lot of discussion about how things are generally quite confusing and not very clear, but in reality there is such a mixed bag of responses, and based on these results there are marginally more people who think that the rules and regulations are quite obvious. The government websites can be a useful and reliable source for finding out the restrictions in your local area, which probably helps to make it easier to understand what you can and cannot do. But the lack of understanding generally comes from grey areas that are not explicitly defined. For example, with the tier restrictions, before the third lockdown, pubs and restaurants were not allowed to serve alcohol unless there was a substantial meal served alongside it. Some people did kick up a fuss about this, because different places can interpret this to mean different things. Say for example, in one location you could order, a Scotch egg, a packet of pork scratchings, or a side portion of chips, and that would be enough to justify a substantial meal. But if you went into another location, they might refuse to serve alcohol unless you bought an entire main course from their menu. That being said though, the substantial meal had been known by pubs for a long time before that, with 16-year-olds being allowed to publicly consume alcohol when eating with adults. The final few questions of my survey are more directed towards people's feelings and mental health. So I asked, in general, how do people feel their mental health has been impacted because of the pandemic? And as you can see from this graph, generally there is a lot more negative than positive response. At the extreme ends, over 16% say that their mental healths have been significantly impacted in a negative way, whilst less than 3% claim significant positive impacts. The most popular answers in this case were having limited or moderately negative impact. So overall, over 70% of the respondents say their mental healths have gotten worse due to the pandemic, compared to only 16% saying that they've seen improvements. I thought I would also ask how the state of people's mental health has changed with each successive lockdown. There were 9 options in this, and I don't want to bore you with going through each of them because they are a bit wordy, but essentially I asked, did your mental health worsen, improve, or neither in the first lockdown, and has it worsened, improved, or neither in each lockdown since then? I found it quite fascinating looking at these results because there was a very, very large mix. The most popular response had 33 votes, saying that mental health was not impacted in any of the lockdowns. But if you look at just the effects of the first lockdown, about half of the people said that it worsened, nearly 40% said it wasn't impacted, while only 10% saw improvement in their mental health. However, since the first lockdown, about 23% have seen improvements in their mental health. And I think it's worth noting that the second most popular answer out of these 9 options said that their mental health did get worse in the first lockdown, but it has been getting better since then, which is really nice to hear. I would assume that one factor for this could be due to people adjusting and getting used to the changes happening, though feel free to tell me why else this might be the case or why this might not be the case in the comments. Unfortunately, over double this number of people have actually seen their mental health get worse since the first lockdown, and I think that this can be explained with some of the responses to my next questions. I decided to ask 2 open-ended questions. The first was, what specific feelings do people experience when the restrictions change? So what do you experience with the easing of restrictions where there's less limitations, or tightening where there's more limitations? And what feelings do you have about the pandemic overall? And this came up with many varied responses. I would have loved to go over so many of these in more detail because some people put some really insightful and thoughtful points in their answers from perspectives that I hadn't really considered before, but that would take me all day. So I'm going to show you some of the word clouds, where the size of the words determines how frequently the answers came up. For example, the bigger the word, the more people claim to experience this feeling. I grouped some feelings under the same word where they had similar definitions. So for example, I changed anxiety to anxious, fed up was equivalent to tired, and where people had put not applicable or nothing, I put none. This is the one for easing and tightening restrictions. And this is the one for the general feelings towards the pandemic. There's less words in the feelings towards restrictions because I think I worded the question in a way that was a little bit difficult to interpret. But the most predominant feelings that were mentioned over here were anxious, followed by frustration, relief, annoyance, and no feelings. In attitudes towards the pandemic, the most mentioned words include fear, tired or fed up, sad, frustrated, and worried. If you look in closer detail at the orientation of the words, I've decided to extrapolate them based on what I would class as negative, neutral, and positive response. Of course, this is up for interpretation, so feel free to let me know where you think I could have moved some words to some other categories. A lot of the words mentioned were somewhere in the middle or more neutral region. A fair portion of people did express having no real feelings towards the changing restrictions or towards the pandemic in general. And some people here pointed out that they're more just impacted by other people's responses to the restrictions and the rules. Looking at the changing pandemic restrictions, there is a lot of uncertainty and caution in people's approaches when they hear about the changing restrictions. A few people have even said that when restrictions are eased, they're unsure about whether they think the new measures are appropriate and safe. Novelty was a really interesting one put here. On the more cynical side, a couple of responses did express that they think the government's approach was a bit of a joke and hard to take something seriously, especially in the hypocrisy that can be shown amongst some of the leaders. Particularly in feelings about the pandemic, there were some showing mixed feelings or none at all, a lot of showing acceptance and seeing these changes as necessary measures, and a few who also thought that the situation is a bit ridiculous or even overrated. So, with the negative word clouds, you can see that there are a lot of words here. And generally we see that there is anxiousness, frustration and annoyance shared in both questions. Through the repeated lockdowns, many people say that they've lost motivation, feeling trapped in their own homes, and they're tired of the monotonous nature of their lives. There is disappointment and frustration as people feel that they've missed out on opportunities and they found new stress with work uncertainties and feel additional annoyance when other people don't seem to be following the rules. One word which was more frequent than I expected was the feeling of hatred towards the pandemic. This is pretty understandable, I think, because the virus has had such a huge and life-changing influence on pretty much everybody. And finally, one thing that I found quite inspiring throughout all of this analysis is the number of positive feelings that people have encapsulated throughout the situation. Looking at the effects of the restrictions, the positive emotions are pretty exclusively related to when restrictions are eased. But there is also understanding, being hopeful and being grateful when restrictions are tightened. In the more optimistic responses towards the overall pandemic, we can see that some of the people have found this to be an opportunity for self-growth, spending time with their families, and inspiring some positive change in the attitudes about health and cleanliness, whilst also expressing sympathy for those who are unable to be with their loved ones at this time. Thanks for watching! I really enjoyed looking over these responses, and I'm quite glad that I sent out this survey because I found that in lockdown, with being more isolated, it's so easy for me to be wrapped up in my own world and thoughts and forgetting that many others are going through the same struggles as I am. There is some solidarity in this, but it was also really helpful knowing that there are positive and hopeful things that can come out of this pandemic too. If you have any thoughts about, say, your own response to the pandemic, or how I can improve my analyses and methods, please feel free to let me know in the comments. That's all I have to say for now. I hope it helped build on your mind.
Thanks for watching. This channel is building on my mind. Check out my other videos, but first hit the bell and comment, like, subscribe. Please, it really helps with the